Welcome ladies and gentlemen to this video, kindly sponsored by a returning sponsor for the channel, Magellan TV. Now you may remember that Magellan hosts a wide variety of curated documentaries covering a huge range of topics, but relevant for viewers of this channel and for the topic of this video, I thought we'd look at this documentary series, World's Greatest Ships. Currently there are 2 seasons, each of 6 episodes, covering a whole range of famous ships from different time periods, all the way back to Drake's Golden Hind and coming right forward into the Second World War with HMS Ark Royal in the last episode of Season 2. Some of these ships still survive today, others, the wrecks have been found, and still others, such as the Golden Hind, the Endeavour, and the Mayflower, have had replicas built, which of course greatly assists with the visual learning component of watching a documentary. And so if you want to watch this series, or you want to watch any number of the other programs that Magellan has to offer, then you can click on the link in the video description below, or you can scan the QR code appearing on screen right now to start a 30-day free trial. And if you like what you see, or you want to see what they come up with next, then of course you can continue on with a subscription. So thank you very much to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video, and now on to the main story. Imagine, if you will, you're in the Bay of Biscay, not the world's most friendliest stretch of sea. You've lost your rudder. You're out of control. This is probably not going to end well for you unless you can get assistance. But it's 2023. You have radios, you have satellite communications, and so you send out a distress call. Now, of course, being 2023, you're expecting maybe a helicopter or a maritime patrol plane, or a Coast Guard unit, maybe if you're lucky a French warship, and at the very least maybe a passing freighter or passenger ship will show up, put down a nice motorized launch, and you'll be safe. Maybe they'll even take you in tow. And then you receive word. A ship is nearby. They're coming to assist you. You look out on the indicated bearing, and out of the mists appears this thing. A fully rigged, under sail, East Indiaman from the 17th century flying the Swedish flag. No, you're not hallucinating. And no, you haven't drunk quite all of the ship's spirits reserves. This is real. You are being rescued in the 21st century by a sailing trade vessel with a full broadside of cannon. And there's the proof taken from the rather bemused disabled modern vessel in question as the 17th century East Indiaman Replica Goteborg took them into tow and to safety. And that is the ship that we're going to be looking at today. But before we step aboard the ship that's around now, let's take a quick dive into her history. The original Gothenburg, or Goteborg, I think that's how it's pronounced, my Swedish is not great, was a ship of the Swedish East India Company, because back in the 18th century everyone had to have an East India Company because that's how you made an awful lot of money. Founded in 1731, the Swedish East India Company was no exception to this and made a number of highly profitable voyages of trade to and from China and the general East Indies, which, if you go to Gothenburg itself, resulted in quite a number of very fine buildings, amongst other things. It's just the buildings are the ones that have mostly survived. Between the time of its founding and 1813, when the company went bankrupt due to changing economic conditions, 37 ships bearing the flag of the company and of course of Sweden managed to complete over 130 voyages. The Goteborg was one of the earliest of these vessels. Launched in 1738 at the Terra Nova shipyards in Stockholm, she would manage to make a total of 3 voyages to China. The first went pretty much without incident and made a great deal of money. The second was almost without incident, albeit when she emerged from Cadiz in Spain, she was captured by a British frigate who presumably thought that she was a hostile trading vessel, but she was eventually released to go about her way and completed that voyage as well. But her last voyage, which started in March 1743, did not go well. She was already sailing late. She'd been delayed by pack ice. She really should have sailed in the autumn, and she still had to fight the remainders of ice as she made her way out of Gothenburg. She then headed for Spain because although Sweden had many trade goods that were considered quite valuable by a lot of people, China only wanted to be paid in silver, and Sweden was not particularly rich in silver. And so she took more regular Swedish trade goods, including a lot of supplies that were useful for making and maintaining ships, and would trade them in Spain for silver, as well as provisions, and then head out to do the next stage of the voyage, which was to pick up all those wonderful silks and porcelains and so forth in China. But then things went wrong still further. She was driven by strong winds almost to the western side of the Atlantic, and then fighting her way back east round the southern tip of Africa, she was forced to wait for 6 months in Java as the delays meant she'd missed the monsoon season, which provided the best winds to reach China itself. And so it wasn't until 1744 that she actually reached China, began her trading mission, and then loaded with tea, silk, porcelain, zinc, spices, and various other bits of cargo, she headed home. The return voyage passed with much fewer incidents than the outward-bound voyage, but unfortunately she fell at the last hurdle in September 1745, 2 years after she'd left port. She was approaching Gothenburg under the control of local pilots, but they managed to run her aground near the Alvsborg fortress on the outer edges of the approach to Gothenburg. Unfortunately, she was stuck on the rocks so hard and with so much damage that it was impossible to get her off of the rocks, but luckily she was close enough to Gothenburg itself that boats came out and everybody on board was saved, as was around 1/3 of the cargo. Between insurance, the salvaging of some of the cargo, and various other measures, the voyage still made a profit despite losing the ship itself and 2/3 of the cargo, which gives you some idea of just how valuable the China trade was. After a few more 18th and 19th century commercial salvage operations, the wreck was just left until in the 1980s archaeological salvage operations and dives were conducted to see what was left of the ship. As you can see here, some of the broken porcelain was actually recovered, and you can even buy fragments of it today. Then, in the 1990s, as the dives came to an end, they came up with the idea of, well, what about building an exact replica? This work was duly undertaken, and the ship was launched in June 2003. She then commenced a series of voyages, including replicating the original ship's expedition to China, albeit without striking rocks on the way back. And then this has been followed up pretty much since that voyage, which concluded in 2007, with a series of cruises around the Baltic, Scandinavian waters, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and generally all around Europe. A planned second voyage to China in 2022 had to be turned into a grand European tour due to COVID restrictions still in force in China at the time. And it was during that altered tour that she rescued the rudderless yacht, as mentioned at the start of the video. She then headed back to Gothenburg, where after 2 decades at sea, she's undergoing a refit to try and ensure that she will have many more decades at sea. And it was here in Stockholm in June 2024 that I caught up with her. So who wants to go aboard an actual working East Indiaman? I know I do. I did. And now you get to as well. This is the site that will greet you as you approach her quayside. You then head into the main admin building on the left, where you can purchase your tickets for your guided tour. They have regularly scheduled tours. I believe it's 4 or 5 in Swedish during the day and 2 in English. There's also a gift shop, which, while small, is actually one of the best curated gift shops I've ever seen for a museum ship, with a variety of things from the regular stuff for the kids through to very interesting books, some in Swedish, some in English, some in both. And for those of you who want to go on a more nautical theme, you can get sailors' shirts, as the same as the crew actually wear when the ship is at sea. Of course, a variety of hats, ship's models, and, as I mentioned earlier, bits of porcelain from the wreck of the original. Now, with all that said, they also let me aboard to do some filming. Hello everybody, and welcome aboard the museum ship-active sailing ship-Indiaman Gothenburg. Now, she is a replica of a Swedish vessel of the same name from the 1700s. The original Gothenburg made a trip to China for trade and then came back again
didn't quite make it, sank outside the harbour, but they were able to recover the crew and the cargo, so it all worked out in the end. Now, this is a replica vessel, but although she is in refit, she is an active sailing vessel, and that means we're going to see a few things that you're not going to see on pretty much any other active or museum ship in the world. There's one or two active sailing replicas, but Goteborg is probably the biggest and the one that's gone the furthest of at least 17th, 18th century ship design. And that means that what you're going to see is a ship that's in ordinary. You've heard me use that term before. It's a period term that essentially means in between voyages. She's having a refit, which is what Goteborg is having done now. And there's therefore going to be a lot of unique stuff that you won't see on a museum ship like Victory, Trincomalee, Constitution, Unicorn, Constellation, Jylland if you're down in Denmark, etc., etc. And one of the first things that's very obvious is the ropes and the deck. Because on a museum ship, you don't want every other person complaining that they're all covered in black sticky substances because of all the tar. So they'll use cleaner ropes. But on Goteborg, you have to have that tar on the ropes because it helps preserve the ropes. That's why it was applied originally in the first place. And it also means, to be honest, in a storm, you've got a lot more grip than you would on a more conventional, especially a modern rope, which might become very, very slick. So as we go around, it's going to look a lot, if you like, dirtier than a museum ship, but that's because she is an active working ship as much as anything else. Now we're going to come around, I'm going to spin the camera around, and this is one of the first things. So this is the bowsprit, but as you can see up top, the jib has been taken off. So it's just the main bowsprit going on, and as you can see, it is also a composite rather than a single bit of wood. So this is one example of what a ship would look like in ordinary. She doesn't have her forward sails and the jib boom out, etc., etc. What you'll also notice is these little steps and these ropes, and yes, that does mean while she is in active service, while she's sailing around, people do actually have to go up out there to have a look and see what's going on, which could be slightly unnerving. Another feature from the period, which has been accurately replicated, as you can see here, are these caps. This is a soft metal, would historically have been lead, there's probably white metal or pewter, but this helps preserve the wood because, of course, you can paint the wood, but the ends of the wood, where the grain is visible, are very susceptible to weathering and swelling, so you cap it off, and that means that the wood stays intact a lot longer. So looking down at the decks here, you can see we've got nice sticky lead, sticky tar, and it is sticking to my feet as we go. Now, you'll hear maybe in the background a slight buzz. That is they're cleaning the deck further aft. Now here you can see this is the main mast and the mizzen mast. Again, you can see it's been cut down because the ship is in ordinary. You can actually see the upper portions of the masts next to the lower portions, and then right up at the top you can see the hole where those upper portions would go through. So these masts have been stepped down. So a minimal amount of rig is there just to keep the lower portion up, because of course the lower portion goes all the way down into the hull, so you can't really take that out unless you're turning the ship into a hulk. But in this way you don't have to maintain the rigging and worry about the top weight of having the ship fully rigged, but you can put it back together in a relatively swift time. And you can see some of the rigging coming down here to the foremast, and here just ahead, so you can see just, here's my finger, there's the upper portion of the mast, there's the lower portion of the mast, and there you can see going up there to the crow's nest, spotting top, and if the ship absolutely has to, fighting top as well. Although hopefully there aren't so many pirates around these days. Now, one thing you'll notice compared to a warship is that we were just on the bow there and we're just walking along the main deck. There is no forecastle. Now, the forecastle has kind of, as a raised structure, gone away to a certain extent already by the time a ship like Goteborg was historically built. But on merchant ships, although they do still carry defensive armament, it's gone away pretty much completely because it doesn't serve a huge amount of purpose for their merchant role. On a warship, the forecastle sticks around a bit longer because it's a good place to put bow chaser guns, it's a good place to try and hold the ship against boarding actions or to fire down into an enemy ship during boarding actions, although it is a lot reduced compared to the period of Mary Rose or Vasa. And just coming a little bit further back, of course, we have the ship's bell, which we shall, of course, ring. And that's still in use. You can see it's made in 2004. That was when the ship is at sea, that's rung every half hour during the watches. So let's head a bit further aft and see what we can find. So we're just a little bit aft of the bell, and one of the things you're going to see as we go down is this long dark piece of wood. This is one of the ship's yards. So this is where the one of the sails would be hung normally. I have a feeling this is the main sail yard. But currently, of course, it's being stored down here whilst the ship is in refit. Again, because having it up there is just a maintenance and safety nightmare when you don't actually need it. But as you can see from the status of this and the status of these housings, you can house pretty much all of the ship's yards and yard arms when the ship is not in active duty. And as we come along here, what do we see here? Well, this is an arm that's going out here, and it's holding one of the ship's boats. So this is fairly typical of how ship's boats would have been deployed in the time period, and it's just sitting riding there. And of course, when a ship historically was at anchor, they would usually anchor outside of a harbour, or in the edges of a harbour, or in the main roadstead, and then the boats would actually go back and forth taking crew and supplies to and from. In some harbours, especially riverine harbours like London, you could of course get a ship up to a quayside or a pierside, but that was a lot more difficult back in the day before steam tugs and stuff started to show up at the beginning of the 19th century, and so it was less commonly done. You could get pulled in by your own boats or by hired boats from the port. You could kedge the ship along with your anchors, and if you got close enough to a pierside, of course, you could send over lines, but it was a lot more of an involved process, a more dangerous process, and a more expensive process. So a lot of the time, ships would tend to just anchor a little bit away from shore and let their boats do their work going back and forth, rather than risk getting too close, unless there was a pressing need. On a warship, for example, if they had to offload the guns. Up here, we're on the quarterdeck, and you get a nice good view down the length of the ship, but also you get critically a much better view of what's going on forward of the ship compared to if you're down on the main deck. And that means that the ship's pilot, if it's coming into or out of harbour, would be standing up here, but they could direct the ship down here. So this is a skylight. This comes out if you need to, and you can see down there is the ship's wheel. The ship's wheel is connected down to the tiller via a rope, and that rope is made of elk hide rather than the more regular rope that's elsewhere on the ship, because this rope has to be incredibly strong given the strains it's under, and you cannot afford for it in any way, shape or form to break. So the ship's wheel is down there underneath the quarterdeck, but a pilot during the coming into and out of harbour or coming into and out of port will be up here yelling instructions down there. Now, we mentioned the ship's wheel before, looking down from the pilot position. That's looking up into the same skylight. So here is the ship's wheel. As you can see, we've got a double wheel with the rope and a bag to keep water off, all there. And you can, in theory, do this one-manned, but typically, because this is connected up as it would be historically, there's no power-assisted steering. It's purely just reduction ratios. You would typically have 2 people on here, but of course you can double up to 4 or possibly more in really rough sea conditions. Because remember, being a historically accurate vessel, if the ship is trying to turn and it's really rough weather, then all the force that's acting on that very large rudder aft is going to be transmitting back through here, trying to turn the rudder back to dead straight. So you might need quite a bit of strength to prevent that from happening and correct. And then coming around here, we have the pin compass, Now you might be wondering, how does this work? There's no magnetic parts to it, this is just all wood. Well, that would be correct. You would need a magnetic compass as well, but this is a way to help you work out where you're going in terms of what kind of course you've been setting. So I do have permission to do that. So this obviously is your compass rose. And what would happen is you've got your 8-hour shift, and every half hour when the bell is rung, someone would look at the compass and they would put the appropriate pin in, because there are 8 holes. And so let's say we're sailing, and on the first half hour we're sailing dead ahead. Great, so we try and put one in there. The next half hour comes along, and now we look at the compass and we're actually going north by northeast. So put a compass in there, a point in there. The next half hour we're still going north by northeast, fantastic. The next half hour, oh, now we're going northeast, so that goes in there. And then in the next half hour, oh no, we're going fully west. Maybe we've made a turn, maybe the wind has turned against us. So we count 5 along, and then that goes west. And then as we try and bring the ship back on course, maybe by the next half hour we're west by northwest. And by the next half hour, let's give another pin, we've managed to get ourselves back to north by northwest. And then in the last hour, we're actually back on course north. And now we can trace, by following the lines, what kind of course we've most likely been following. So obviously if you were at the start and end and you thought, oh okay, we're just heading north, you might think you've gone straight, but by looking at this you can tell that actually plot this against time and you're actually on a very meandering course. You probably haven't gone as far north as you think you have. So a very handy device once you get to use it. And this is just one little extra bit of equipment that you just find randomly lying around here. So obviously we have some modern stuff because she is still a modern vessel, but this is a sounding line. So this is a big lump of lead, and you can see there's a little indent on the bottom. Now historically that indent would be filled with tallow, which is a kind of animal fat, and then you would chuck this over the side. Obviously you've got the rope so you can bring it back in, but then this would hit the bottom and you'd know from the length of rope therefore how deep the water is in the vicinity of your vessel. And when it comes up, the tallow lump that's on the end of this lead weight would hopefully have snagged some of the seabed. So was it silty, was it sandy, was it rocky? You'd be able to tell hopefully by examining what was stuck in the tallow. Now of course we're at the mizzen mast, the aftmost mast, and we have some of the rigging here which allows you to climb up. Now of course back in the day there was no safety equipment. If you fell off, and that was pretty much the end of you. You can use safety equipment to climb this section, but in more typical operations, climbing this part of the ship's rigging, you usually wouldn't use too much in the way of safety equipment, but you'd have it with you for when you actually start going out onto the ship's yard arms to deal with the sail. The ship is of course flying the correct flag. And once again, we get a good view of what a ship's masts look like when she's in ordinary. Obviously now we're back on the poop deck and you can see the main mast and the foremast there, just the lower portions. And you can appreciate just how much less rigging is necessary, even when compared to this relatively small tall ship just over there on the other side of the harbour. Now, as you can see in her case, the rigging that's holding up the lower portion of the mast just consists of essentially 2 lines with a set of steps in between, as opposed to over here where you've got 4 lines with steps in between lower down, and that's just on the mizzen mast. On the main mast you've got 8 lines, of which 7 have steps between them, but you can see all the additional rope that's there, plus all the additional lines that are holding up the full extent of the bowsprit and those upper sections of the mast, as compared to this much larger, much more complicated ship where we just have the initial lower rigging. Now here we have the ship's capstan, or at least the upper part of the capstan. The capstan goes below deck, so there's an additional point on the gun deck, so you can have multiple crew sections working all at once. There's a dozen points on this one, I think there's 6 on the lower one, and they're all got these capstan sections which go in like so, and then you have up to two people, one if necessary, one normally, but maybe up to two. So with this you can have up to 24 people, and they can push the capstan round. Now, of course, in the old days, you would have a capstan for the anchors. On the Goteborg, on this replica ship, they have an electric hoist forward for the anchors, so they don't need to use the capstan for that. But one of the other things you need to use a capstan for is actually putting the ship into and out of ordinary. So we've got the one end of the yardarm here, and of course we've got the masts. Now, these days, obviously, you can employ a dockside crane if you want, but if you don't want to, or you can't, you can sling a rope around the capstan and have it taken up there, and you get everyone on here and turn it around, and as it turns around, obviously the rope gets tightened around the base of the capstan, and you can actually bring up a good chunk of the ship's masts, rigging and yards purely under muscle power. And then once all that's set up, you can also use the capstan again with rope around it, run up to the upper portion of the rigging to help raise and lower the sails if you need to. You obviously would only do that in extreme circumstances where you need a huge amount of effort, because normally, obviously, you'd have people up there on the yardarms dealing with the sails, but if you need a little bit of extra help, this is available.
And there's also these little ratchet blocks. You can see their arc of movement there, and that means that whilst the capstan is being wound, you can at any point lock it off. So if people need to stop pushing for whatever reason, maybe they need a break, maybe they're called off to do something else, the whole thing isn't going to just suddenly unwind, spool out, probably clock everyone in the head with those arms, and then unfurl whatever it is you've been trying to furl. But let's head below decks and see what's down there.
Well, we're now one deck below, so this is the first continuous covered deck of the ship, and this is where the man known as the supercargo would live and do business, because of course he's in charge of the cargo, he needs to make sure it's sold for the best price and so forth. So he would have the very fancy brocade, and this would be where people would be brought to conduct their trade deals. So it's all very fancy, and unlike a warship, so if you've been in Victory or Constitution or so forth, if this was a warship, even a frigate, you'd have a gun port here, a gun port there. All of this would be very quickly removable for chase guns. Here, the walls are solid. You probably, in theory, might be able to bring a chase gun through, but very unlikely, because all of this is much more solid, much slower. It would be much slower to convert all of this. And you have a lot more furniture rather than just one table. You've got 3 tables, you've got storage cabinets, and the ship's cabins continue forward of us. So I'm just going to grab you, and we're going to spin around. So of course you have a library, because it is a ship before modern people, but you have little cabins here. All of this would be as per historical. So much more enclosed, but feeling much more here like a small apartment suite than on a warship. But reminding you that you do live in interesting times, we have the gun deck. So there's a lower capstan just here. So this connects directly to the capstan up top, and as you can see, slightly fewer capstan points. Then we have a little bit of the original Goteborg, which has come with her new replica namesake. We've got some ropes being stored here, and I'm just going to pop you down here and flick you around. Fantastic. And as you can see, we've now got one of the ship's masts coming down through the decks. We've got more rope here because, of course, when ropes snap, and they inevitably will, you need plenty of spares, so there's rope all over the place. On a big warship, of course, all this rope, either on a frigate, would be down in the hold, but on a merchant ship, the hold is needed for cargo, so it's up here, and on a first rate, the rope would be partially down in the hold and partially up front, although on the lower gun deck. But again, it's a merchant ship, not a warship, so it can be stored up here, because you wouldn't store too much cargo on the gun deck. Firstly, because you need it to fight. Secondly, because this would be where most of the crew slept, which is actually similar to a warship. And thirdly, of course, because most of your cargoes can be down in the lower holds, because it's hopefully nice and heavy, which means it's nice and valuable. But as you would find on a typical ship of the line, you've got hammocks, you've got mess tables, which are removable, of course, they're suspended, mess benches, and of course you have cannon. Now, a ship of this size, if it was a warship, would obviously have more cannon and heavier cannon, but the threat of piracy is ever present, and so Gothenburg, which is relatively large for her period as far as merchant ships go, because she is supposed to go across the world for trade, does have a number of fairly heavy guns for a merchant ship. They're not 32-pounders or even 24-pounders, but they'll see off most pirates and perhaps even small raiding craft, unrated stuff like brigs and schooners and maybe a sloop or two. But if we count, we've got one there. This is number 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got a similar number on the other side, plus 2 more gun ports, which are currently occupied with rope. So that would give us 6 per side. And I'm just going to go forward and see if there's another gun port. There is, so that would be 7. And then we run out of space because forward of that is the medical area. So 7 guns per side, 14 guns total on the main gun deck. And as you probably saw while we were up top, there's a couple of additional piercings on the main deck for guns. So if she was in full active service, you'd be talking about 18 to 20 guns, not including if you had any bow chasers or signal guns. So Gothenburg wouldn't quite be a rated ship, but she would be relatively heavily armed as far as an unrated ship is concerned, at least if you were using the military measure of things. Hence why she could potentially see off brigs and sloops and schooners and so forth, because she has a similar amount or superior armament to them, assuming that they're not carrying carronades, and she's that much larger, which is going to make boarding actions very difficult. The flip side, of course, is a military ship would have a higher rate of fire because they have trained gunners. They'd have proportionally more crew, which makes things a bit more difficult for a ship like Gothenburg. But it gives her a reasonable fighting chance, and most pirates would have a ship that is far less well equipped and far smaller than this. So it keeps her crew and her cargo secure against pretty much everything other than a full rated warship. But as far as merchant ships go, there isn't really much they can do if a full rated warship shows up, so that's not really a mark against her. One of the other things you might notice while I'm walking around is that I can walk around. So yeah, I have my protective hat, but I haven't actually smacked my head on any of the beams. And that is where this ship differs slightly from her namesake. She's got the same proportions, the same lines, the same depth, the same rigging, etc. But the original ship, the original Gothenburg of the 1700s, did actually have double gun decks. So whereas this Gothenburg, as we said, would not quite make the rating system, the original ship had 2 levels of gun decks, which actually would make her a theoretically rated ship if she was taken into active naval service. But in a concession to more modern concerns, you can imagine fitting 2 gun decks in the space where this ship has just the 1 plus crew accommodation below, because of course she's not hauling massive amounts of silver to China, meant that, well, those 2 gun decks would have been very small, like you would see on a frigate or on HMS Victory, so you would be smacking your head. So instead of putting in 2 unnecessary gun decks, they put 1 in, which gives you the feel, the historical accuracy of it, but then gives you A, the space to walk around the gun deck and enjoy it, and 2, the space to walk around and actually enjoy being on board if you happen to be the crew further below, rather than everyone losing their brain cells every 5 minutes because of low beams. Now the other thing we're just going to show you while we're down here is this section. So we're in the forward part of the ship, and as you can see, again, a working ship. We've got all sorts of tools for rope and wood and so forth. But what you have here, as well as some sections of rope, is some of the tools the crew actually use. So this is a device, I'm left-handed, so I'm doing it completely wrong, but like so. So this is to help you sew sails if they rip or whatever, because of course this is very thick, very heavy canvas. So if you use a normal thimble, you will not have the finger strength. So instead you have effectively a hand thimble, so you can get the needle in there and push with your whole body strength to sew up that. You've got a caulking hammer to make sure all the caulk between the decks is put in place. And you've also got these things. So this little wedge-shaped tool, that's for hammering the tarred caulking into between the decks. And then this marlin spike, which comes in this particular case metal, but you can also get them in wood. So this has a lot of uses. I mean, in a boarding action, you just clock someone with it. But when you're working with rope, it has two primary uses. When the rope is still usable, but perhaps is getting a bit loose, you can work it in between the sections and then twist to tighten the rope up. But when the rope is dead, either because it's partially rotted or it's snapped and it's no longer long enough, or for whatever reason, you can also use this to unpick the rope. So you untwist it, because of course each rope is made up of strands which go into a single cord, which is then wrapped into multiple cords, which goes into the total rope. And this is actually where one of the origins of the phrase "new money for old rope," because old rope was not useful for a ship, so it would be discarded. But if you had nothing better to do on a ship, or if you were in a port and the ship had discarded all its old rope, you could use one of these to unpick the rope. And eventually, if you unpick the rope enough, you'll end up back with the original cordage that the rope was made of in the first place, the fibers that were originally bound together. And this could be treated with tar, and then this would then be hammered using this into the gaps between the ship's planking to keep the ship watertight. And of course, because you put a lot of work into it, you could sell the product of your labor, hence new money for old rope. So this is just forward of the gun deck, so you can see again we've got a mix of old and new, because it is a ship that with modern safety standards and so forth. So we've got the small ship's carpenter section. Again, on a warship this would be lower down below the waterline, because all of this section would be still full of guns, bow chasers and the forward guns of the port and starboard battery. But on a merchant ship, this forward section can be used for other purposes, which as you can see it is. And just in there, around there in the darkness, is the modern ship's galley. So this is where all the food is prepared. And there's, you've got the door there, both in English and in Swedish. And we're just next to the ship's wheel. So this is some of the examples of what they would have been wearing. So there's no particular uniform, because of course this isn't a military vessel, and even on a military vessel, uniforms post-date the original Gothenburg by quite a bit. But here on the left you can see what a slightly lower ranked member of the crew might be wearing, but they've still got a decent jacket, so not an everyday sailor would have some kind of skill or specialisation. And then of course the captain would be wearing something very fancy, because after all that's how you know he's the captain. He gets paid more so he can afford it. So that wraps up our visit to the museum and actual live sailing ship at Gothenburg. Now, if you want to come and see it yourself, I highly encourage you to do so. Obviously, she's in Gothenburg in Sweden at the moment, and during the summer, she's open for tours between 10 and 4. There are quite a few Swedish language tours, but they're also at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock. There are English language tours if you don't happen to speak Swedish, and I can confirm the staff here speak very good English. They're certainly a lot better than my Swedish. And depending on the time that this video goes live, there may be a link in the video description below. They're also starting a Friends of the Ship Gothenburg Association. So if you want to help them with the costs of refitting the ship and help her get back into service, then of course you can go and do that. And if that hasn't gone live by the time this video is released, then it will do in the future. So maybe keep an eye out for that. Because of course, as I said, she is in Ordinary at the moment. She's been to China and back. She's been all around the Mediterranean, the Bay of Biscay and the North Sea. And she needs a bit of work, as any typical ship of her time would, to get her all the way back into full sailing condition. And they're working on it at the moment. They do have sponsors, but every bit helps.
And the good news is that website is now up as part of the ship's overall site. So there will be a link in the description below, but if you don't want to go there, you can go to goteborg.se, that's GOTHEBORG.se, and that's where you'll find all the information about the ship that you need. So for example, at the moment, during the summer. She's open 7 days a week between 10 o'clock and 5. She's located in the Eriksberg portion of the city of Gothenburg, which is the north side of the river. And you can get there from the main city centre by bus, by ferry, by car, by taxi, or as I did, by a little hireable electric scooter. You can book your tickets online, which will obviously reserve you a slot at a particular tour period, or you can turn up and just hope that there are enough tickets on that particular tour. They're usually quite flexible, but obviously if you have a large party, it's best to book ahead. Tickets cost 150 Swedish krona, which is about 10 or 11 British pounds, $12, $13, and 75 Swedish krona for kids between 7 and 14. So that's about 5 English pounds and about $6.50. And if children are under 7, then they get aboard free. And if you'd like to become a supporter of the ship, then on the same site, at the top bar, you've got the Visit Us section, the News section, where you can read more about the rescue of that yacht, and then the Join Us section. And under the Join Us section, you've got Volunteer, so you can become part of the volunteer ship's crew, if you happen to be in the area. And then there's Friends of the Goteborg of Sweden, and that is the bit where you'll want to go. So what do you get as a member, aside from obviously the fact that you get to support such a wonderful ship? Well, you get access to their newsletter, where they'll keep you up to date with the ship's maintenance and overhaul and any future voyages. You get a 10% discount at the shop and cafe there in Eriksberg, as well as if it happens to visit a port near you, you get a discount there as well. You get a discount on your bookings if you want to go and visit the ship. And you can hire the ship for private and corporate events, by the way, which, that's another way of supporting the ship. If you happen to be a bigger company, or I don't know, you want to get married on an East Indiaman for some reason. The ship's crew also maintain a series of lectures and other educational activities, so as a member you get priority access to those. And of course you can attend the annual general meeting if you happen to be in Sweden physically, or I suppose via Zoom or something if you happen to be overseas. For an individual, that membership is 160 krona per year, so only 10 krona more than a tour of the ship, which, again, for those of you who need currency conversions, that's 11 to 12 British pounds, $13 to $14. Really not bad value for membership. And of course, when the ship is back in service and out on voyages, you can actually become part of the crew for various legs of those voyages, something which I plan to do in the future, as well as, of course, being a supporting member, because I'm not just saying you should do it, I am officially a member of the Friends of Gothenburg as well. So thanks very much to the exceptional crew who showed me around, let me film, let me fly my drone around, and were generally very friendly. Hope you enjoyed the video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.